All right. Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about functions, what they are and why are they going to be useful for us in learning processing and some coding. And so I want to kind of identify some patterns that's been going on so far in this course, and that is the has to do with the concept of abstraction. So what is abstraction, you may think? Well, what abstraction is when we identify certain patterns, in our case, certain patterns in our code, and what we want to do is instead of just kind of coding up examples of these patterns, we want to see what's common between these things we're coding up, identify the patterns that kind of is common between everything, and instead of coding up those individual things, let's code up the patterns themselves. And so, that's a bit of a conceptual idea there. But what I'm basically talking about, if we go back to some more specific examples, is remember when we talked about variables to begin with? Well, before we did variables, we coded up everything. We just hard coded, right? So if you want to draw a circle, you said, I want the circle specifically at this position with this diameter. You hard coded everything with straight up numbers. No variables, no anything like that. However, what we could see is that as we were coding different shapes and everything, sometimes you wanted relationships between these different things, right? Maybe you want this circle to be 2 times the size of this circle, right? And so what you could do then to make that work is say, hey, make this circle 2 times the size of the other one. Okay, so you can start having some math here. But instead of keeping it these hard-coded numbers, what we instead did is we learned about this new concept called variables. So we were able to kind of abstract over these different patterns we were seeing about, well, you could form mathematical relationships between these things. And instead of just keeping it as hard-coded numbers, we could go to variables and start using them instead. And so this is actually a more useful kind of higher concept. And again, the general kind of workflow we've been doing here is that we'll learn a new concept, which makes us have to do more work up front. But in the long run in our program, it makes things so much easier and so much less work. And so that's kind of what we've been doing here with abstraction. Same thing with loops. So, before if I said, hey, draw me, 100 circles or something. Before we went over loops, what you would have done is you would have said circle, your circle command, circle command, circle command, circle command. And, let's say I told you to draw 100 circles in a row, something like that. You could probably look at all that and identify patterns in that. Because what you would see is that every circle has the same y position and the same diameter, but different x's. And so all you were doing is changing the x for every circle command, right? Well, what we could do is abstract over that pattern, say, okay, what's common between all these commands? And in this case, it'd be like the y and the diameter. And what's different? Well, it's the x's. What we can then do is use a loop to change that one thing, in this case, the x value, right? And so we identify a pattern, and instead of leaving everything separate, we just code up the pattern itself. So we just code up the loop, which just all it does is it changes that one variable, in this case, the x position. And that allows us to, again, we might be a little bit more work up front. In this case, I think it's less work up front, but it's also much less work in the long run as well. And so these are different tools that we've been learning and using to make things easier for us. And so we're going to take a big step into abstraction today with functions. And so that's why I want to kind of go over this concept. And I want to emphasize this word tools. We've been making tools to help us do different things. So variables are a tool. They make it easier for us to form robust relationships between things in our program. Way back when with the house example, if you want to make, where you make the base of the house wider, if you want the roof to go with it, you're going to need some kind of mathematical relationship. Variables help us do that. Variables also make it easy where I can just change one number, the value of that variable, and that change will kind of go through the whole program. So that variables are very powerful for that. They're a tool which helps make that sort of thing easier. Loops are a tool which makes it easier for us to do many of the same thing, like draw many circles in a row. It's a tool that helps makes us do that. The next tool we're going to talk about in this course is functions. So we're going to talk about that next. Now, functions, what are they? Well, first off, they're a block of code. Just like an if statement has the curly brackets, and I've been describing that as a block of code. We have loops with the curly brackets, that's a block of code. Functions are also going to be a block of code, so they're going to have the same curly brackets. And what they help us do, loops help us do many things, variables help us form relationships and that sort of thing. What do functions help us do? Well, they help us organize our code for one. So they help us say, okay, we have a code that, we'll draw 5 circles, or we'll draw a star, something like that, right? And that's going to be a very, very organized now, or that's going to be in a very specific spot. So it helps us organize our code. But more specifically, it's going to be a tool which allows us to use in a very specific situation. So let me give an example of this. So let's take a step away from abstract land, and let's go into some concrete examples here. So before I show you the code, what I'm going to do is I'm going to press play here. You see, okay, I got some smiley faces here. That's nice and cute, right? Let me show you what I did to make these smiley faces. Because you're probably thinking, well, there's a circle, a big circle, made it yellow, then there's these 2 circles, and then there's like an arc. You're probably seeing those individual shapes. But here's the thing. Look in my draw. All I have are some smile commands. Now, here's the thing. If you look in the processing documentation, there are no smile commands. There's nothing in the documentation that says smile. So then why does this work? Why do I say, put at position 100, 100 of a size 100 and press play? I put one right on top of that one. So let me actually move that to the side a little bit so we can still see this one right here. There he is. Okay. What if I do this one? This time I'm going to make it there. You can see, boom, another smiley face, right? I'm seeing all these smileys. They're all just kind of popping up. What if I do something like this, where I have a mouse press function? Mouse pressed. Do this right here. And then what if I say, draw a smile at my mouse X, mouse Y, with a size of 100. Check it out. If I press play, smile, 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 I can start having these smileys all over the place using this smile command. But the thing is, that smile command does not exist naturally in processing. So what the heck? What is this? Well, this is the power functions, right? So what I've done here is I've made a function called smile. And the way I coded it up, the way I've made this function is I made this first number the X position of my smile. I made this number the Y position of my smile, and I made this number the size of my smile. So that way, even if in my mouse press here, if I make it 200 now, you'll see by changing that number, they're now bigger than what they were. If I make it smaller, if I make it 50, and I press play, now whenever I do it, it's smaller now, right? So now I've made myself a tool, I've made myself a function that allows me to, in this case, make smiley faces. Now, of course, this doesn't have to be used for making smiley faces. You can do anything you want. And functions are used all the time. And so let me actually go down and show you my function. So we'll talk about what all of these pieces mean here in a bit. I will say that all of this right here, this is just for drawing a smiley face. It's really not all that important, really. You've done this type of thing. Formed relationships between things like you did with the house, or maybe with the car robot assignment if you're in the 103 class. But we will talk about, what is this bit? What does that mean? So in fact, let's go ahead and start doing that right now. So back to the slides. How do we make a function? Well, I have a very specific example here, in this case for my smile, but here's a more kind of abstract template for making a function. The first thing you need is the function type. We will talk more about that in a bit. We also need the function name. That's just like a variable name. Remember, with variables, you get to come up with the name of your variable, and you can make it any name you want. So you can call it X or Circle X or Billy Bob, whatever. You can name it whatever you want. Same thing with function. With a function, you can name it whatever you want. I always tend to name my function something that makes sense according to what it does. In this case, I made my smile function. I named it smile because what does it do? It draws a smile. So I thought that made sense. There's also these parameters between these parentheses. Now, this is where you get some creative freedom here, right? These parameters, for one, you don't have to have any. You could have nothing in between these parentheses. You could have 0 parameters. You could also have 1, 2, 3, 500, 600. I've never seen something with 600. But you can have as many parameters as you want in here. What these do, these are things that allow you to control different aspects of your function. So if I look here, in my smile example, let's go through everything, right? So first is the type. In this case, I'm not giving a type. Again, we'll talk about that in a second. But because this doesn't have a type that it's giving back to me, I called it void. Again, we'll talk about that in a second. The name is smile. So it's going to draw a smiley face. So I thought smile made sense. Now, these parameters, though, that's these things here inside the parentheses. So what do these do? Well, these allow me to control different things about my function. In this case, about my smile. And so what do I have here? Well, when I made this, I was thinking, well, if I'm going to draw a smiley face, what kinds of things do I want to control with this? Well, I want to control the position, which that would mean I need to control the X position and the Y position. So I'm like, okay, that's two parameters I want. I want the X position and the Y position of this. I also thought, well, I can make the smile bigger or smaller as well. So I control the size, which in this case is the diameter of the smile. And so these are different things I wanted to control within my function. These may have different values at different times, right? If I want a smile at a different position or a different size, I'd want to change those values. So anything you want to change and anything you want to control, these are parameters that you would use in your function. And so that's what I did here for my smile. And let's go back to my actual code here. So let's take a closer look. So if I look at this, I have my parameters, the face X, face Y, face size. Here's the thing about parameters. When you make your function, they are only placeholders. At this point in time, these do not have values. That's what I mean when I say they're only placeholders. They do not have any values yet. Face X, it's not equal to anything yet. I will make it equal to something in a second when I actually use my function, but when I'm just making my function, these do not have values. These are variables without values. So like face X right now, it's not equal to anything yet. Same thing with face Y and face size. That may seem a bit weird, but you'll see why here in a second. So let's just go through this function and let's see what happens here. So, I set the stroke to be white. I then made some other variables inside my function. We'll talk about variables inside functions later on. But I made some variables. You see, though, I made them related to variables I had up here. So I said like eye size equal to my face size divided by 7.5. The reason for 7.5 is just because I played with the numbers until it looked right. And so I made some of these other variables, but they're all defined relative to face size. You see, they're also always divided, like face size divided by something. What that allows us to do is eye size, if I make face size bigger, eye size will also be bigger. Same thing with mouse width and mouse height. If I change the value of face size, the values of these will also change. So what that does is it just makes it so that the eyes and the mouth, their size is always in proportion to the overall size of the whole smiley face. So that's what that does. Then you just see that's yellow. So I made the fill yellow. Then I drew the head, the overall circle, just using my variables, face X, face Y, face size. Okay, cool. I then drew the eyes. Again, it's all variables, but what I've done here, I just used variables that I have defined from here. So everything is defined relative to these three variables. So the position of the eyes is defined relative to these. And then the eye size, well, that was also defined relative to the face size, right? Same thing for the other eye as well. Same thing with the mouth. Face X, and then Y position is depending on face Y and face size. Well, those were these input parameters. Same thing, mouth width, mouth height. Well, that's dependent on the face size as well. So all these values are dependent on these variables right here. So whenever these change, whenever the face X changes, so does the X of the eye, and the X of the mouth also changes. Same thing if I change face Y, the Y values of all the eyes and the mouth change as well. And that's that. Now, again, remember what I said, is that these parameters do not have values while we're making the function. So how does it know what to make eye size and mouth width and mouth? How does it know what numbers to end up using, right? How does it know to put it at these positions, at these sizes, if there's no numbers involved? Okay, so that is where the difference lies. So the difference between making the function and using it. The difference is that when you're making the function, these variables, these inputs, these parameters do not have a value. But if I go into my draw, you see here, I'm actually using numbers inside these parentheses. This is where I'm actually giving values to my function. So if I scroll back down to my smile, face X, face Y, face size, that's the order, face X, face Y, face size. If I come up here, when I use my function, so this is when I'm actually going to draw a smiley face, instead of face X here, I'm saying 100. What this does, when processing sees this, it says, okay, you defined a function called smile. So let me go down to it. And you also said smile, and then the first value is 100. Processing goes down to this, to where I made it, and it replaces face X with 100. So then everywhere that there's face X, it puts 100 there, all the way down through. That's what processing does whenever I press play here. Same thing. It replaces face Y with 100, and it replaces face size with 50. So when I use my function here, it says, okay, face X right now is going to be equal to 100. Face Y right now is going to be equal to 100. Face size is going to be equal to 50. Now that these have values, eye size has a value, mouth width has a value, mouth height has a value, and it can draw the smiley face with all of these appropriate values. Same thing. Then I call smile face again up here in my draw, but this time I said 500, 500, 400. What it does here says, okay, face X is going to be 500, face Y is 500, face size is 400. Then it uses that to draw the smiley face, right? And so this is how they get values. It's when I use my function, usually in your setup or your draw. And so these parameters, these inputs down here where I make the function, they have no values yet. It's not until I actually use it is when they get values. And I know I've said that a million times so far, but that's very, very important. And I found that that trips people up a good bit. Because a lot of people, I'll see them, they'll make the function, and they immediately go like, they say something like, well, just make face X equal to 100, you know, and then make face Y equal to 100, and make face size equal to, let's say, 50 or something, right? And they say, well, that should work, right? But the thing is, if I press play, you see all those smiley faces that I did have drawn? Now they're all right here. In fact, they're all drawn, but they're all drawn as the same smiley face on top of each other. That's because if you go ahead and just give them all a value when you make the function, well, then I can never change them. They're kind of hard-coded, right? And so when I give it these different values here, well, it doesn't matter, because even though this was made 100, I wrote over it. So whatever value you made these lines just write over it. And so that messes you up, right? And so for these parameters inside your, or the parameters of your function, the ones inside the parentheses, you don't want to give them a value inside where you're making your function. You want to give them a value when you use your function by giving actual numbers inside your parentheses. So now, since I got rid of where I hard-coded those, if I press play, you'll see now that they are spread out, and I could use my mouse pressed again, and they go where my mouse is. So hopefully this is all making sense. And again, if it doesn't, you're gonna have to try it. Like all things in coding, right? It's hard for things to make sense until you actually do stuff, right? And so, but yeah, so let's continue on. I do want to say there's more examples. I'm going to talk about this a lot in a future lesson on functions, but I want to go ahead and make you aware that this is a thing. And so I have, let's say, another function here called square it. Now you see here, what's different about how I define square it versus smiley? Well, for one, I don't have a lot of code in here, but I also see how this is no longer void. In my smile function, this was void. So now let's take a second. Let's talk about what this thing is, which, if you remember, that is the function type. And I said we'd talk about it later, so let's go ahead and talk about it a little bit now. We're going to talk about it a lot in a future lesson as well. But I want to go ahead and touch on it now so you're aware. Some functions, some functions like the smile function, it just does something, right? Other functions, they might do something, but then they'll give you something in return. So when you call the function, they will then give you a value. Okay? Smile does not do that. It does not give us anything. It just draws a smiley face. But it's not giving us a number. It's not giving us a string. It's not giving us something. But let's look at this square it function. This function does give us something. What it's going to give us, so first off, what does this function do? I'll let you look at it for a second. What it's going to do is whatever value that I put inside these parentheses is going to return that value squared. So I can even show you an example of that. So I have down here my function, square it. What does it do? Well, it's called square it. The type is int, and again, we'll touch on that. I have this parameter here. It's an n. It's called int, and I'll tell it to return n times n. So what does this return do? What is it doing? We know it has something to do with squaring n, because n times n here. Okay. Well, what it's going to do, if I come back up here to my draw, and if I print out square it 2, let's see what it prints out at the bottom here. So we don't care about smiley faces right now. But you see what it does is it prints out 4. So I said square it 2, it printed out 4. Okay, interesting. So let's look at that. So I had my placeholder, my parameter n, which remember, while I'm making my function, does not have a value. So n does not have a value, right? Not while I'm making it. Then I told it to return, in other words, give me, so return a value, give me a value equal to n times n. Okay, well, remember, when I'm making the function, n does not have a value, but then up here, I use the function, and when I use the function, I give that input parameter a value. I gave it a value of 2, so it returned 2 times 2, which is 4. So that's the difference between like the smiley function, which didn't give me anything, right, versus the square it function. It does actually give me something. It gives me a value of 4. And so to help you understand what that means, let's say I have like int a var, right? If I can say make a var equals to square it 2. And then I can print a var. If I press play, you see that works. There's no problems here. It prints the same thing. It prints 4. That's because whenever I call this function, it's going to return the value of n times n. Well, in this case, n is 2, so it returns 2 squared, which is 4. So a var is going to be equal to 4. So then when I print a var, it prints out 4. But the smile function, which again, if I look at my smile function, there's no return. You see, there's this return word that's in square it. I don't have any return here in smile. And so if I make something like a var equals smile, you see, it won't even let me run it. Like it says there's an error. Because smile, because there's no return, it doesn't ever give me anything. It's not going to hand me a value. So I can't ever set a variable equal to it, because what am I setting it equal to? It's not giving me anything, right? And again, we'll talk about this more in a future lesson, but I want you to go ahead and be aware of what this is, because that's very common to see in functions. Now, let's go back to the type, which remember is this thing right here. So this is the type, this is the name, this is the parameter. This type is int. How do we know what type it is? How come it's not a Boolean? How come it's not void, like the smiley face, or even string, right? How do we know what type it is? Well, it depends on what type of thing it's returning. So I told it to return n times n. And so what type of thing do I want this to be? Well, I want that thing to be an int. So I had the type of the function to be an int. So whatever type of thing it returns, that's what type of function this is. Int, in this case. Now, if I go back to smiley face, or the smile function, it doesn't return anything. So what type of function is this? Well, since it doesn't return anything, you say it's void. What does void mean like in general? Void means like it's absence of something. There's nothing there. It's absent. Well, smile is not returning anything. So there's an absence of a value to return. So what type of thing is it? Well, it's void, because there's an absence of a type. And so that's why smile is void, and that's why square it is an int of type. What's also kind of fun here is that we talked about way back when, we talked about the mouse press function, we talked about the the setup function, the draw function, and check it out. These are actually functions. So I made the smile function here. It does a thing, right? It draws a smiley face. It's a void. Well, it turns out setup is also a function. It's just a very special function in processing, right? Where, processing knows to run the setup function once at the beginning. But what type of thing is setup? Well, we know there's no return in setup, so it's a type void. Same thing with draw. It's a function of, the type is void, the name is draw with no parameters. Now, it doesn't return anything. There's no return value here in my draw, and so it's a type void. And so this is bugging me. Oh, I deleted AVAR. That's right. That's why that's throwing me an error. But hopefully that makes sense. If there's no return, it's going to be void. And it turns out setup and draw, they've been functions all along. And they don't return anything. So they are also type void. Now, some things to keep in mind real quick, just to review, is that any parameters in your functions, they must be declared in the parentheses of your function. So in fact, I'm going to go back to my example here. So if you look at where I make my smiley, you see I'm declaring my variables here where I'm making my function. Face X did not already exist up above. Face Y did not exist above. Face size did not exist above. And that is how it should be. These should not exist anywhere except where we're making this function. So when if you want a variable to be here, it can exist above. It needs to be made inside this function, inside these parentheses. And so you also, of course, whenever you make a variable and declare it, you need to tell it a type as well. So no face X is going to be an int, face Y is an int, face size is an int. So you got to have those there inside your function. So keep that in mind. And another thing I want to emphasize, again, is that all these parameters for your functions are placeholders. So they should not be given values while you're making the function. It's not until you actually move on to using the function is when you give them values. And again, just review this. I know I've said this a million times, but it's really, really, really important. When I make my smile function, these parameters right here do not have any values yet. It's not equal to anything. It's not equal to 50. It's not equal to 100. It's not equal to anything yet. But when I go to my draw, do something like this, I put these numbers in between these parentheses. These numbers are then set equal to these variables. So in this case, face X is made equal to 100. In this case, face Y is equal to this number, which is 100. Face size is equal to this number, which is 50. And so, when you're making the function, they're just placeholders. They don't have any values. That's very important. But once you use your function and you give them values, then those variables will end up having values. Now, that being said, check it out. If I only try to give it 2, so if it didn't give face size a value, you see it freaks out. It says, whoa, whoa, whoa. You gave me 2 things, so I know what to make face X and face Y, but I don't know what to make face size. And so, what's nice about it is that if you forget, to give them values when you use it, it will yell at you because it doesn't know what to do. And so you have to give each of those 3 variables a value whenever you use your function. And so it's also a good idea for these parameters. In this case, I had face X, face Y, face size. These should not have the same names as any global variables, right? So if you have a variable up here and you had something called face X, even if you want this to be different from your other face X down here, if they have the same name, like that, you shouldn't do that. If you have a global variable, you should not have any of these have the same name as any of those global variables. It will get confused about which is which, and it might overwrite values on top of each other. It's going to be a big mess. You don't want that. And so yeah. I also want to point out that functions, I mentioned before, they help organize your code. And that's especially the case once you have really big programs. If you're in the 103 class, and for your final project, you're going to make a video game, right? And it's probably going to be thousands of lines of code, something like that. Well, when you have that much code, it's really, really nice to have these functions that do a very specific thing. So if something doesn't work, like in this case, if I press play, and I know my smiley face looks wrong, I know to look specifically in my smile function code. I don't have to look all over my entire program. I know, well, hey, my smile face, if it looks weird or my eyes are misplaced, the one place that's probably responsible for that is my smile function. So it helps organize your code. It helps, kind of keeps things in their own little block. And so it helps you fix things if things break it later on in the future as well, which is very nice. And so I think that's all I have. I do just want to emphasize that functions are tools. They're very important. They make tasks easier for us. And so an example that I always think about is, if I put you in a room and I said, hey, nail these two pieces of wood together, and you didn't have any tools, that's very, very difficult. I mean, you could probably do it, right? You could eventually, over time, maybe put a nail through these two pieces of wood, almost like Shaolin monks, they'll punching their training on like brick walls and stuff. And, after 30 years of doing that, there's like a divot in the brick wall. They finally erode away some of that, So, I mean, it may be possible eventually for you to nail two things together without any tools, but it's very, very difficult and it'd be full of suffering and just be awful, right? And so that's no good. But if you just have a tool, something like a hammer, well, that makes things much, much easier for you, right? So you just boom, 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 you hammer it away, you're good to go. And what's cool about a tool is it doesn't just help you do it once, but it helps you do it over and over and over again. Same thing with the functions. Functions are tools. They make things easier, and they allow you to do things over and over and over again. So like my smile face function, it's not helpful just because it helped me make one smiley face. It's helpful because I can make as many smiley faces as I want. You saw me, I was just clicking, click, 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 and I was making all these smiley faces. Easy as can be, and it's because I had the function. Now that being said, there are some tools that are better than others. So you could have a hammer versus a nail gun. Well, if a hammer, it's pretty good, but it's going to take a few swings to get that nail in, usually. But a nail gun, you just boom, 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 boom. You just line them all up. And so just like there's some tools better, like a nail gun tends to be better than a hammer, or at least in terms of speed, there's other functions that you can make that are better as well. So you can imagine if I want to draw like 5 smiley faces, I could have one function that draws one smiley face. But then I can have another function that uses that other function to help it out, but that kind of lays them all out in maybe a pattern of 5 or something. And then I can have that one function that would just draw 5 smiley faces, which is pretty cool. Just to keep in mind, but functions are tools. They make things easier for us. And yeah, that's basically it. And so a challenge for you is to make a function that will draw a row of circles. And so, let me pull that up really quick. You see here what I have, and I press play. I have all these fun circles, lines of circles, and they flip the colors and all that good stuff. That's awesome. Now, there are all kind of patterns here. They're rows of circles laid out horizontally. They all have 3 colors. And so what's cool is if I look in my draw function, what did I do? Well, I just gave it the position, size of my circles, and then the 3 colors of my circles. Here, let me make that wider so you can see everything. And you can see I used my draw circles function that I made to then just draw out all of these fun patterns. So I've made a tool for myself that allows me to draw this row of circles, and I just gave it, in this case, 6 parameters that control the position, size, and the colors of these circles. So like here you can see like the third one was the size. You see it 50, 25. And you see 50, 25. You can see the difference there. Also, the last 3 parameters are colors. You see that like these first 2, it's just red, green, and blue. These other ones have more interesting colors. And you can see, of course, we can see that as well here. And so I've made a function here that allows me to do this, and I encourage you to do that as well. So try and make a function. I called mine draw circles. Have 6 parameters where you have the position of the first circle. So the X of the first circle, the Y of the first circle, then the size of all the circles, the diameters, and then 3 colors. And then you just have it draw a line of circles in a row until you reach the end of your window. So that's my challenge for you. I hope this makes sense to you. And of course, if you're in my 103 class, come talk to me if you'd like to talk about this more. And thank you so much for coming by. Thank you for your time, and I will see you next time.